Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to yet another podcast. Once again, I always have interesting guests, and today is definitely no exception. Today I have Melanie Bennet, and she co-hosts a Gender Wars podcast with my friend Shannon Boshi. And she's very informed about all the gender stuff happening in the schools and in education, and it's always a pleasure talking to her. She was at a National Parents' Rights Summit meeting that we've had as well, and she was the first person to speak. She spoke right before me, and the material that she presented was pretty eye-opening. And I gotta say, I'm always shocked that I'm still shocked when I see this material. And Melanie, thank you once again for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you're quite active online and you post a lot of interesting things. I really do like keeping up, and I gotta say, it's like a love and a hate thing for me, because it's good to keep up, but at the same time, I feel like my brain cells are dying every time I hear about this information. How did you get into it? And it seems like it's a little bit of a passion of yours, just like this is a passion of mine as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's sort of like driving past a car crash, and you have to look. It's so it's just this morbid curiosity, and I think that also describes how I came into contact with this. I don't like to go too much into my personal life, but it's because of meeting certain young people in my own personal life that I came across the new transgender. I used to think, like many people, about transsexual, or, so the old version, somebody who's uncomfortable with their sex and feels more comfortable presenting as the opposite sex for whatever reason. Came across that in my youth, and I was fine with that. But when I came across certain young people and the new version, which was reality defying ideology, where I came to understand it to be, I became very curious as to where this came from. The idea that you could transform yourself quite literally from one sex to another, or at least that's the belief that these young people have. And I, over time, became familiar with queer theory. And ever since then, that's the car crash for me. I cannot stop reading about queer theory papers, learning about queer theory. I'm still in the beginning of that process, really, even though I've been doing it for maybe a year on and off. And that's kind of how I came across it, really. Not an expert, certainly not an expert in terms of the educational process, but I've sort of started getting more acquainted with how it manifests itself in the education system here in Canada, or at least I'm trying to learn a bit more about that these days. But yeah, for me, absolute fascination with queer, what it is, and how it's manifesting in society and with young people.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I want to actually get right into it. And what is queer? You actually did a very recent post on Twitter about it. And you did a thread and you said, "We're hearing a lot about queer youth, but what is a queer child? Let's examine a Canadian paper that explains it." And then you say, you say right away, "Dyer explains that innocence is a concept that opposes the child and limits their queer potential." That's interesting. When you see that a child's innocence is a kind of victim mentality that oppresses them. What do you think about that?
Well, I came across something, I guess, that you could call the myth of childhood innocence a little while back, just sort of briefly. I'd also heard about it mentioned, but I hadn't seen it so explicitly explained in a paper such as this one. So this paper I think you're referring to is called Queer Futurity and Childhood Innocence Beyond the Injury of Development. And that's from a person called Hannah Dyer. At the time of writing this in 2017 was at Carleton University. I think they've moved on to Brock University since. And this is a academic educator. So the academic pedagogical thinking that goes into the materials and instruction to teachers. So it's the academic step before it goes into the classroom. And this person describes in quite vivid detail the myth of childhood innocence and how that's viewed in a queer theorist's mind. And in a nutshell, you could say, based on this writing, that childhood innocence is a settler colonial concept It's a Eurocentric concept, and it oppresses the child's ability to be fully queer, or as they describe, fully creative, to explore their queer curiosity. And by queer, again, in the paper, they very explicitly describe queerness not so much as a sexual orientation, although they include that within the LGBTQIA+, but also as a political identity, which is not an identity, which is actually the opposite of an identity, but a political state of being that undoes all that it views as normative or normal. So normal family, normal traditions, because being normal, well, I won't go into it too much. I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but that's the gist of it, really.
Yeah, I do find that the entire concept of queer is basically take all the values, like traditional values, even in terms of like family. And I'm not even talking just traditional, just family values, kids, identity, and flip everything upside down. And to me, it's almost seems like a rebellion. You know, you do
so what
the
you've
opposite.
What you've just described is what they view as heteronormativity. So heteronormativity is born from childhood innocence. So the presumption that children do not have a sexuality. So children are asexual, and they should be protected from the sexuality and sexual exploration at a young age. So that sort of concept of childhood innocence, they believe that it supports proto-heterosexuality, right? And so what they mean by that is that if you do not sexualize the child and introduce them to a queer mode of being, you're sort of preparing them for a heterosexual future, and you're denying them the ability to explore their queer self. And by doing that, you are oppressing the child's potential queerness. Like, it's sort of in a roundabout kind of way, but that is the thing. They believe that by presuming it's kind of paranoid in a way, because it's presuming that the innocence is predetermining that the child's going to be heterosexual, because we live in a homophobic world, and it's homophobic to presume heterosexuality. It does go in circles quite a bit, but they presume that if you queer the child, you are providing the child with a liberatory experience. And so queer adults were once queer children, or gay adults were once gay children. We'll just talk about the queer, because I think that's really what they're talking about. And those queer adults were suppressed in their youth. They were traumatized in their youth because they were not exploring their future queer selves. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's their justification, because it is unkind not to queer children for the potential of queer futures.
Honestly, this is quite the amount of mental gymnastics that one has to go through in order to kind of come to these conclusions. You know, I think right off the bat, without diving too much intellectually and just philosophizing on this, I actually have a problem with adults wanting to sexualize children. You know, before we even get into like the mental gymnastics that these intellects have to go through, you know, I don't know why they think it's appropriate to sexualize children and to bring out a child's sexuality and what their preference is. You know, this behavior is concerning, to say the least, but I find it very interesting how this is getting pushed in at all levels of academics, right? This is obviously in schools. It's also in the public sphere as well. I take the girls swimming to public pools, and they have special programs for people who are not. I think we need to make a distinction, because I'm very, very interested in queer theory and how that presents itself, because I believe that this is the root of the transgender movement. Now, trans studies, I guess, is a different, technically is a different area of study, but I believe that it all sort of stems from queer theory. And so it's, in my opinion, it's an offshoot from queer theory. And that's when you believe that, so queering, let's just be clear. Queer theory presumes that anything that is normal is bad. And so it seeks to undermine and deconstruct
all normative structures to liberate people to reach their full capacity. And so because it's a Marxist theory, it's always about becoming something. So you're never fully queer, I guess. You're always seeking to become queer. So it's an ongoing process of doing that. And one of the ways of doing that is transgender. So by also mystifying the idea of sex. So we start introducing a lot of concepts like, well, when you have gender, which is the idea, is the performing your sex. So performing the expectation of your sex really is what gender means nowadays. So, for example, if you're female, if your sex is female and you present, I guess, like me, in a traditionally female manner, I am performing my sex. Therefore, my gender is woman, right? And so ultimately, they're saying that that's different from sex. And I'm saying that it isn't. Gender is sex and sex is gender, regardless of the performativity of it. But the transgender movement uses queer theory to sort of mystify the sex on top of that. So it's not just gender, it's also the sex. So if you feel like, I used to be a tomboy, and so the YRDSB in their gender expression and identity policy, in there they have a description of transgender, and that is, if you are not performing the societal expectation of your sex, then you're trans. So let's unpack that. If I am a tomboy, which I used to be as a child, I did not look and behave in the societal expectation for female category, for the woman category, that performative category. And therefore, you are not cis, and therefore you're trans, cis being normal, I guess. And so that's where transgender comes from through queer theory, is that it's about the performativity. And so nowadays, if I was young and still a tomboy, and I fully imagine I could have been swayed by this mode of thinking too, because I was actually quite tomboyish, that it gives you this idea that sex becomes gender and gender becomes sex, but in a different way. So by performing masculinity, somehow your sex is now masculine and you were born in the wrong body. And that's what we're seeing. So we're seeing sort of a version of queer theory manifest itself through transgender individuals, and mostly young people, although older people are still doing it, but it's predominantly young people. And you also see that more of the queer identity in things like non-binary. So it's the rejection of the male and female, and that is ultimately the rejection of normativity, which is queer theory. So they're all sort of stemming from the same thing. But because transsexuals are a thing, there are people who are uncomfortable with their sex, it got lopped into the LGB community with the T on top because it was a different kind of sexuality, which is non-heterosexual. But because T became manipulated, and over time, the new transgender really just means queer. It's just an element of queer. And that gets lumped in there as well. But this is political. This is not at all about sexual orientation. It's an entirely different kettle of fish. But because it's lumped into that, and because the West has a strong sensitivity to homophobia, as it should, because it's been shown over and over that people are born with their sexual orientation. But because there's a sensitivity to this homophobia, because it's a very real thing, in the past, people absolutely did suffer injustices and violence based on their sexual orientation. But that's largely gone. And now we're fighting this war with the Q. But because of that, now you have in schools teachers who are already empathetic and primed through the colleges of education, really, to think of queer as the same thing as LGB and the old version of T. So when you're presenting that, so when someone comes around and says, this doesn't make sense, this queerness is maybe not the best thing to be doing, well, that is equated to homophobia, which is transphobia, which is the new homophobia, right? And so I think we really need to unpick that for regular people. I think it's really important. When I fully understood the difference between those things, that's when I really, that's really what brought me to try to work, to try to bring as much information to the public as possible, because it's out there. And so that paper that I mentioned at the very beginning, it does lay out very, very clearly in there its intentions, that they're not really hiding it that much. And that's the same for many other papers from academics that I've read here in Canada, Canadian academics on this topic, through the pedagogical academic papers. So went on a little rant there, but
Yeah,
that's the gist.
I find it very interesting. Billboard Chris says there's two sexes, zero genders, and an infinite amount of personalities. And I think right now, this whole gender thing, it's a personality trait from what I could see. They're trying to describe personalities specifically in terms of sexual preferences. I think gender is personalities for sexual preferences, whatever. Or I suppose I'm saying the same thing.
Billboard Chris is very, very concise in how he explains it. And I have a lot of respect for him in doing that. I tend to waffle on into the details because I'm really interested in those details, those philosophical details. But he's correct. I think I fully agree with that statement. And what queer does is that it uses jargon and language manipulation to obfuscate that very simple premise that a stable-minded adult understands, is that there are two sexes. We are human beings. We're not clownfish. We can't change sex. That's not a thing. And multiple personalities, because just because you're female does not mean that you cannot have male typical interests, for example. That doesn't make you a man. It just makes you a girl who likes something that might be typically considered male.
That's right. And the irony in all of this is that they really work on stereotypes. Like if you like this, then you must be this. If you like this, then you must be this. And it's very ironic how this transgender movement, this queer theory, it really is very stereotypical, and it labels everybody, which is interesting. I've actually talked to a non-binary girl at the Million March protest, and the reason why she was non-binary, she told me, is because she views men as the perpetrators and men will take advantage. And so she doesn't want to present as a man, and she views women essentially as victims and weak at the hands of men. So she doesn't want to present as a woman either because she doesn't want to be viewed as weak. But this lady, she was a mom, she had a kid, and in her mind, she had these expectations that she had to live up to, and she put men in a box, like this is how men behave. She put women in a box, this is how women behave. And she was having a hard time with that. And she also didn't appreciate, the counter protesters, the LGBTQ side, on how they're trying to sexualize kids. She also admitted that. I felt really bad for this girl. I told her, like, look, you could be a strong woman. You can have your opinions, right? And she said, well, I like, men. And she said, but if I was a guy, that would make me gay. And I said, yeah, but you're not a guy. You're just a girl that likes boys. And that's fine, right? Like, you don't have to feel bad about your preferences. You could just be who you are, right? And I told her, like, I work with a lot of great women, especially in this field. There's so many amazing women that are speaking up for the protection of kids. And I said, I don't really know why you think that women are weak. Like, in my opinion, they're just kicking ass, and it's awesome.
Yeah, well, I mean, shorthand, that's feminism for you. I did notice from the 2010s this increasing habit of moving towards group identities and describing those group identities with certain qualities. And I definitely noticed that in feminism, that the patriarchy seemed to have resurfaced maybe around the 2010s, so around then. But that's following liberation philosophy versus what we used to do in the West, which is liberal philosophy. So liberation versus liberal sound similar, but again, two very different things. And liberation philosophy underpins all of this critical consciousness, the intersectional stuff that we see in the schools. It's basically putting people in identity categories. We label them, and you assign certain characteristics to those categories. And I think feminism, unfortunately, has really gone down the road of believing that all women are victims and all men are victimizers, which isn't the case. Because look, it's true that most of the violent offenders are men, but that is different from saying that all men are victimizers, and that disempowers women from their own choices. It produces an external locus of control versus an internal one. So that's a liberation philosophy. It externalizes the responsibility for your life elsewhere. So I am a victim because those people are victimizing me. And that's the same for all of the intersectional categories. Whereas,
so basically the liberation comes, it's a liberation from personal responsibility.
As well, yeah. The liberation part of the liberation philosophy comes from undoing that category. And so for the liberation feminists, I guess female liberation, women's lib, it would be undermining men, which is kind of what we're seeing nowadays. I do feel that men are very undermined by women generally who follow that philosophy. But liberalism is different because it gives individuals autonomy and responsibility over their lives. And so it's not an identity category, it's an individual choice. And so it's based on merit, right? It's completely different. It's an internal locus of control. The control for your life is within you. You have control over what happens to you. I mean, there's things out of our control in life, sure. But generally, it empowers individuals to make choices that allow them to better themselves in their lives. And I feel like the West has really been taken over by liberation philosophy and has completely ignored liberal philosophy. And we're really seeing the effects in schools. So intersectional is all over schools. And that is entirely about placing certain people in, well, we can say victimizers and victimized people. We can also say the dominated and the dominators, right? So, I mean, in this case, if we're talking about trans, heterosexual people are the victimizers, and trans people, or it would be cis people in this case. So cis is a new term that we've devised to say normal non-trans people, so the opposite of trans. So those people are victimizers. They're put in that inherent category. All of them. If you're cis, you're a victimizer, unless you're an ally. That's a whole other thing. It's your way out of being a victimizer, being an ally, which just means being another radical. But if you're trans, then inherently you are placed in the victimized category. Now, the problem, I'm no psychologist, but I know enough pop psychology to understand that when you place the locus of control of your life outside of yourself and you victimize yourself, or you perceive yourself to be a victim, it creates a mindset that increases anxiety, depression, anger, negative emotion, because you're not taking responsibility for yourself. Okay. And I really believe we're seeing this with young people. So when you look at a lot of these protests, so an example right now is the idea that all these kids are going to kill themselves. It's repeated over and over and over again. Okay. All these trans kids are going to kill themselves. Now, regardless of whether a kid who is maybe confused about their sex, maybe going through some difficult times and identifying as non-binary or trans or whatever, they keep getting told the locus of control, pardon me, is outside of you. You are a victim. That's what we're saying. All these victims, these poor victims, are going to be assaulted. They're going to be beaten up. There's no evidence of this, but we're telling them this. And so what does that do to a young person? That puts them in a victim category. It externalizes the control of their lives outward to those mean people who are doing it to them. And that has significant impacts on mental health. And so is it that young people are suffering a lot of mental health issues because they're trans or non-binary? Or is it because we keep putting them in victim categories? On the flip side of that, you have perfectly kids who, okay, so non-binary is a really good example. What the hell is non-binary? Does not exist. My personal feeling is that it's increasing because it's a way out of a victimized category. Like you just described, that person saw women as victims. Well, one way that you can display that you are not a victim, and I guess in a roundabout way, try to take control of your life, is to identify out of that category. You're still identifying into a category. You are still kind of in a liberatory mindset, but it's a way of saying, I'm not a victim. I think it's
that
unfortunate.
Makes sense.
I think we really need to move, my personal feeling is we need to move away from that identity politics, from liberation philosophy, and moving more towards personal responsibility. I think mental health will improve quite a bit if people do that.
Thank you for watching. If you appreciate the work that I do, please consider supporting me financially. And if you can't support financially, I would appreciate it if you help me overcome the censorship and just share these videos with other people so they know exactly what is happening. I left a link in the description to my Ko-fi account where you can do a one-time donation or a monthly subscription. Anything helps and your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you once again. Yeah, it's pretty crazy to me, the kind of psychological effects, that people jump through if they view men as oppressors and women as people of victims, and they don't want to take part in that, what they call toxic masculinity, toxic femininity, right? And they just want to opt out. They don't want to be associated with toxic.
Well, look what's happening with dads right now. If you keep telling men all the time that they're horrible and they need to shut up and sit down, well, eventually they're going to shut up and sit down. And now all of a sudden you start seeing women complain, well, where are all the men? We need the men. Where are all the men? How come they're not standing up? Well, I would go as far as to say as many men are not standing up now because we've told them to shut up and sit down for so long. I think we need to stop treating men as though they're bad inherently on the basis of their sex.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that men need to, stand up a little bit and speak out and not just blindly follow things. And I think men and women, we're both extremely, extremely important in this. And we got to work together. And obviously from my side, from what I see, the people that I work with, they're amazing people, both men and the women. And the worst part of this ideology is how it affects the kids and the psychological and physical ramifications that come out of this, right? We're facilitating, celebrating this trans ideology, where seemingly politicians, and I've seen, ever since the Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, she put out that new policy, the NDP, they've been losing their mind over this. And it's so interesting to see politicians essentially want to promote what I view as child abuse and exploitation through the medical industry.
Well, because they don't view it that way. I don't think they view it that way. And I think it would be very difficult to get them to view it that way. Because I truly believe, like we discussed in the very beginning, from my understanding of queer theory, they really truly believe, for the most part, that they're liberating young minds. Because in the past, because of a heteronormative society, we were traumatizing future queer kids because of the assumption that they were innocent, the assumption that they didn't have a sexuality. And they really, for the most part, I think, do believe that by liberating that potential queerness, that we're helping young people. Now, I do also believe that there's predators who are going to attach themselves to that. You did a really good article recently about the steps of grooming. And I think an astute groomer obviously sees this as an opportunity. And we see it over and over again. You see the amount of people who are queer, trans, in the, following this liberatory queer philosophy be arrested for sex crimes with minors. So there is a lot of potential for abuse because of this, because of the ideology. But I think for the most part, they don't view it that way. And if you look at, so I spent most of my life in the UK, and I'm just acquainting myself with Canadian politics. And I'm not super familiar, but my understanding of the NDP is that they are essentially started as a socialist party for the workers. And because of that, inherently have a liberatory mindset from the very beginning based in Marxist theory. Because that's what the workers' socialist parties were in the 1930s and 20s and all that, throughout. So because of that, you have a long history of viewing people as categories of, victims and victimizers. And so that's embedded within the actual structure of that party. So they're going to take that mindset. They're going to take that view of the world. Now, when we look at the liberals, so in the name, they're telling you they are liberal. Well, a liberal is not liberatory. A liberal is the idea of the individual has the power within themselves to raise them out of difficult circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not what they're doing. They've adopted this group identity mindset. So I guess begs a question as to why they've done that. I guess they're no longer liberal. That's how I view it.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I'm never going to remember this. On Women's Day last year, Justin Trudeau, he posted a tweet. Honestly, he couldn't help himself. And he said something along the lines of, and one more thing, trans women are women. And to me, it was like, I don't get it. When you can no longer tell the difference between men and women, I don't think you could be trusted to lead, because like everything is just up in the air and arbitrary, and stuff like that just makes me lose respect, and it makes me lose anything
it's an
I have.
identifier.
Yeah.
It's not. I mean, these people, everyone can tell the difference between a man and woman. I think there's edge cases where that's very difficult, because let's be honest, sometimes it is. But I would say 90% of the time, you can tell who's a man, who's a woman. Like, that's embedded within us as human beings to be able to tell that sort of thing.
Do you find that they just say really crazy things to just
of course they do, but
see who's on our side?
That is what it is. I do think it's signaling. It's really about signaling your allegiance to a particular group, right? In this case, the division in society is whether you're a liberal or, well, in the liberal world anyway. I'm not a conservative, if that's obvious, but whether you're a liberal, a classical liberal, or whether you're a liberatory Marxist, basically. I think I heard a podcast recently. This person, I think is either American or Canadian, in the UK, has just released the very first anti-woke course at university in the UK. So I was curious to listen to a podcast from him, and he described that liberal philosophy has been overtaken and really influenced by the Marxist revolutionary philosophies, that liberatory philosophy. But not all liberals are Marxists. And you can see that, as I really don't think the vast majority of people really want to overthrow society. And that's what Marxism wants to do. It wants to completely overthrow society to bring about a revolution, and that revolution brings about utopia. But I don't think most people want to do that. I think some of the trans activists obviously do. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Antifa and so on and so forth. But for the most part, your neighbor who's a liberal, who puts out maybe a progress pride flag, they're probably not. They could be, but they're probably not. These are probably liberal people. Canada has been, my understanding, quite left-leaning liberal for quite some time, always in opposition to the US and their own Republicans over there. And so it's a lot easier. This man described that it was a lot easier for liberals to sympathize with radicals, or at least the manipulations that radicals put forward, and believe it blindly, than it is for more conservative-minded people. And so this divide has been created where liberals are mostly on the side of this revolutionary Marxist thinking, but because I think they believe the or they believe the manipulations that are being presented to them without looking too deeply under the surface. And I can say, as I used to be a progressive leftist in my previous career, and I fully believed the manipulations that were being presented until I bothered to look under the lid and really get to know it. But I don't think most people are going to do that. They're just going to automatically sympathize with what's being presented to them. And I think that's what we're seeing. That's why I put out what I put out. I'm trying to present the information in a hopes that people will see that this is not an exaggeration, that what you're supporting is not what's being presented to you.
I also find it very interesting, when I post things, people will flat out say like, no, we're not doing that to kids. No, that is not happening. There are no such books in school. There's no such talks with kids. You're lying. It's so interesting to me that, there's people who are diehard supporters and they don't even know that this stuff is going on. It's crazy.
Yeah, that's what I mean, though. I think that for the most part, I think there are people who know exactly what's going on, who are lying and are trying to spread lies. That is true. But I also believe that there are very few people doing this. I do believe that it's because most people are not willing to look beyond the obvious. They are believing what people are telling them because of their own sympathies. I got accused. Okay, so I've defected from the left, I guess you could say this, and my own family have accused me of going down a right-wing extremism rabbit hole and being in an echo chamber. And one thing I noticed is that as I have exited that left echo chamber, it's become pretty obvious to me that there are still echo chambers along right-leaning circles. that exists. But what's been obvious to me is that the tight control over the echo chamber in the left is far more substantial than anything else I've seen on the right. Maybe because I've taken more of a center position. I don't know what it is, but it seems to me that the allegiance to the left narrative is much, much greater if you are a liberal or a leftist-minded person. It's a lot harder. It was really difficult for me to come out to my friends and family about what I'd been discovering, because I knew that, or at least I had a very strong feeling that I would be rejected for it. And I was. I wasn't rejected immediately, but I became the suppressive person, right? What I'm saying is an exaggeration. I've become, so I think that's where this is coming from. Is these people are too afraid and they're stopping themselves from investigating it further because there are consequences. And I think that whether you admit it to yourself or not, these consequences are along the lines of your family and friends rejecting you, losing your job. I mean, you hear it all the time, these people leaking things and not being able to speak to their own families because they know that could result in not having a family. So
yeah,
I don't know. I think that's mostly where that's coming from.
Have you thought about it too? I've also tried to look at the angle. This seems like a religious movement as well. You know, you get a lot of people trying to atone for their sins, right? Get the whiteness flogged out of them, saying, I deserve nothing. I brought all this stuff, right? Like, you're doing a lot of that stuff. You have like hierarchies as well with, you got these people who are viewed as like the priests of it, who are diehards for this religion, right? And then what do you think about that from like a spiritual, religious perspective?
I can speak as someone who doesn't believe in God. I'm atheist. And I can say that I don't want to call it wokeness, I'll just call it intersectional. The intersectional lens absolutely requires faith. In the sense, I understand it as the concept of critical thinking. And so for the intersectional person, let's start from the beginning. So the classical sense of critical thinking is so I have a science background, and this is my classical understanding of critical thinking is about gathering. So you start with a hypothesis and you gather information. So the question might be, if we keep it on topic, does non-binary exist? Okay. So you have a hypothesis. And from that hypothesis, you'll then gather information, whether it's in support or whether it debunks, whatever. You're trying to find information, and then you use that information and data to make or come to a conclusion based on the information that was provided to you. So that's critical thinking. But critical thinking has been co-opted to mean something completely different, which often happens with the intersectional crowd. And it reverses that. So what it means is thinking along a dialectic. So you criticize something. Okay, so let me explain that a little bit better. You start with the conclusion. So the conclusion is there is oppression for non-binary people, or let's just say non-binary people are oppressed. Okay, so not only are there non-binary people, but they're oppressed. And the critical part of that thinking is identifying where in society that oppression manifests itself, and then deconstructing the structures that undermine it to liberate the non-binary. Okay, so it's very, very, very different. And so the faith element comes from the presumption that this exists, and not only does it exist, it's oppressive or suppressive, right? So it could be that heteronormativity exists, and you show how it's manifesting in society and how it suppresses everyone else. So that's, to me, the faith element to that. And there's other cult elements to this too, because, I just described my exit from leftism and how my own family members, it really strained relationships with my own family over it. And it very much felt like in Scientology, they have the concept of the suppressive person. And so that's a person who, when they no longer believe, when they have doubts, they're cast out. They are labeled a suppressive person. And in this case, it's a right-wing extremist. And you don't talk to them because they could infect your mind with their heretic ideas. We don't want that. And so that's the other element of the religious aspect of that. In fact, fun fact, as I was doing a lot of reading about different topics, including Marxism. I became very, very interested in the history of Marxism too. But it turns out that I think it was the 1950s, during the McCarthy period, that the US Congress wanted to classify communism as a religion because of that faith that's required, right? Because of I can't go into too much more detail. I'm sure you can find it online, but I mean, there was an attempt to place communism, i.e. really, I think they meant Marxism, as a religion in the past. And frankly,
absolutely.
the new version of that is critical consciousness, right? So it's all about raising your consciousness in a critical way to the oppression in society, which is the religious aspect to that. So yeah, I would agree. I think there's a lot of, I don't so much religious, but much more occulty, because you have to adhere to the tribe. You cannot not believe, and not believing, i.e. not being an ally, means that you get chucked out. So to me, that's more culty than religious.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And one of the things that I've noticed, I was trying to think of it from a religious perspective, and how, who's the God in this religion? And
yourself.
One of the things that I've noticed exactly is yourself, right? And it's your truth and your truth only. And it's really an inversion of religion as well. It's an anti-religion from what I've seen.
Let's think of trans. Somehow the mind is separate from the body. Okay. And not only is the mind separate from the body, so there's a soul. So there's your religious element. The soul exists, and your soul is sexed. Now, this mystical soul, if a person is born in the wrong body, right, the part of that religion is they need to realign that. And so you need to elevate yourself. It's kind of like a phoenix rising from the ashes, right? So they're shedding the shackles of their corporal reality into the mystical self, the new self, the trans being. And you see that, is it the black trans woman is the most oppressed, and therefore this is the unicorn for that particular religion, right? So you have to really celebrate the black trans marginalized woman. So is that what you meant? Like, to me, there's a lot, there's so much religious iconography in that too. And also with allies, right? So original sin, you have to shed the original sin. And to do that, you have to become an ally. So you have to say, I am white and I am an oppressor. I've caused colonial genocide. And so I have to then bow down to the black trans women, as a means of repenting for the original sin of being white or trans or cis or whatever it is, right?
It's crazy. Yeah. I mean, I see it from that perspective too. And, you're atoning for your sins. You're asking for forgiveness, and you want to be accepted and be part of it. Right. Yeah. It's very interesting. With the premier of Alberta, announcing the new policies, the people on the left, have been losing their minds over this. And I listened to the policy, and I'm sure you've listened to the announcement. I thought it was very well balanced, in my opinion. And I think Danielle is a great premier. What do you think is going to be the future of Canada in terms of the gender ideology with the announcement of the policies? Do you think other provinces are going to adapt, or do you think she's going to get pressured to revert the policies? What do you think?
You're asking someone who, again, is still familiarizing herself with Canadian politics. I can only speak on how I understand humans to be, regardless of the political environment. I really do believe this is just a matter of time before society in general, all over the world, rejects queer theory, rejects transgenderism, rejects the idea that children should be put on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and have mastectomies at 15 or whatever. I do think it's just a matter of time before that gets rejected, because it's so egregious. But how that manifests itself in different countries, I think that's the difference, So Europe is obviously really backing away, but they have some systems in place that are helping that. So for example, in the UK, for the Ministry of Education, they're not allowed, it is illegal to teach ideological concepts as simply real. They have to be presented as an ideology and then speak about all the different ways of understanding the world, right? So then they don't obviously do this. I mean, obviously the TRAs are finding ways around it, and there's a big lawsuit right now. But the concept is that trans is a way of looking at the world. And it's among other ways of looking at the world. I think Canada could do with having something like this, but it does not, because it's enshrined it in its own laws. So I think it's going to take a lot longer. And I think so far my understanding is I think the law is going to be the pathway to reverse some of this madness. Because I don't see how that we're going to, I just don't. So this queer theory is so embedded in the educational system, not just the educational system. It seems to me the entire social sciences have been completely infected with not just queer theory, but intersectional, liberatory philosophy, right? Critical consciousness. So how we're going to unpick that, I don't know. And certainly with, gender being enshrined in law, like somehow having a gender identity has been legally recognized. So unless we undo that, I don't know how that's gonna manifest itself. And certainly, I've learned recently that parents' rights actually aren't a thing in Canada, that children's rights are a thing, which again brings you back to the mature minor, which brings you back to some of this queer theory stuff. This has been going on a long time. I think a lot of activists under the radar have been working to change the laws and change the policies for a long time. And so we have a situation now where minors are considered to potentially be mature minors, in which case they can make decisions without parents, because parents do not have parental rights. They have all the responsibilities. So if something goes wrong with your child, you are responsible. If your child, if you don't do a good job as a parent, you can be put in jail, and for a good reason, right? So you should not be abusing your child. But on the flip side, if the state decides that they know better, or want to help your kid know better for themselves, you are not trusted to have the capacity to know what's better for your own child. And I think most parents are perfectly fine. And look, there's going to be diversity in families, diversity in religious views, diversities in all kinds of things. And so the state has one way of understanding the world. And right now it's almost like we're moving into a world where if you don't align with that, then you're seen as abusive, and we're going to protect your children from you because we know better. And that is a thing in Canada. So I think I think this is the next frontier, in my opinion, about, Canadians need to understand that the state views their children as their property, essentially. And not just the state, the schools, the medical class, the experts, the academics. Everyone sees you as just the thing that's raising that kid, but actually we know what's best for them. And so I really, that's another hope that I have, is that by spreading this information, we can get that into the minds of most parents, right? Who I think probably think that that parents' rights are a thing. We keep talking about, or we keep seeing people post, comments like, I can't believe this person is saying there's no parents' rights. And until the summit, the Parents' Rights Coalition Summit of Canada, I think it was 2 weekends ago, listening to Bruce Pardy explain, no, there is no such thing as parents' rights. So I think we need to address the law. And I think once we address the law, I think it's just a matter of time.
I'm seeing this anti-government ideology movement, aka parents standing up. I'm seeing a tidal wave coming through right now, and I remember where we were a couple years ago. I mean, I didn't even know any of this stuff, and right now people are openly talking about it. I go to the school boards and I delegate about this kind of stuff, and I think people are becoming aware. And it's only going to be a matter of time, because if we didn't have these conversations 2 years ago, and now this stuff is in the spotlight, I think we've come a long way, and I don't think there's any stopping. What do you think?
Well, the positive view is sure. Yeah, I also see more people waking up. When I speak to people in my everyday life, they pretty much agree with what I'm doing. I think most people do think this is a little bit nutty, but the cynical view is that this really is embedded within the zealous activist class, who happen to be the laptop class, who happen to be the people in positions of political power, who happen to be running our schools, who happen to be running our universities, who happen to be running the colleges of psychology and of medicine and of nursing. These are essentially the ally class. They're the zealous activists for the most part, or at least primed into believing that intersectional is the way to move forward, this DEI stuff. So the cynical view might be, well, there's an uphill battle because right now, sure, people are waking up to it, but the laws are really stacked against the general public. So even if, what is it, Angus Poll said that nearly 80% of Canadians agreed that parents should be made aware and parents' rights should be a thing. Well, does that matter if the law is basically saying and embedded in human rights, the Human Rights Code, that actually you don't matter? So I don't know. I do think it's really important for people to be aware. And I think we're still waking up the general population. And I think that's positive. But whether or not those people who are now discovering what's really going on care enough to do something about it, I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I love a good battle myself, and I'm actually pretty excited about all of this, and got people like you as well, and Shannon, and a bunch of great people just fighting for the protection of kids. Melanie, is there anything else that you wanted to add that maybe I didn't ask you that you wanted to clarify on?
I would just like to encourage anyone listening, if this is of interest to you, a lot of the stuff that the opposite side or the intersectional minded side say isn't true. It's just not happening. It's just not happening. I've discovered that a lot of this is made very, very clear in both the policies that are written and the academic journals that are written. And so you really can't say it's not happening because it's right there in black and white for the most part. And I also just remind everyone that there is such a thing here in Ontario called the Trans Affirming Toolkit. The Trans Affirming Toolkit is for Ontario educators, not just teachers. And it is an entirely ideological document laying out how things like this queer paper that we discussed in the very beginning can then be brought into the classroom. Yes, in formal lessons, as Danielle Smith described them, i.e., we're going to learn about gender identity today, boys and girls, but also in a subversive manner in which it is infused into all elements of the curriculum. So I highly encourage everyone to take the time to go read a little bit of the Trans Affirming Toolkit if you're in Ontario especially. There's also lots of stuff going on with SOGI 123 in BC, but for now, I'm going to point everyone towards the Trans Affirming Toolkit, which I think is a huge deal. So yeah, that's my final thought.
Well, where can they find this Trans Affirming Toolkit?
It's Western University.
Western University, put it out?
If you just Google in Trans Affirming Toolkit Western, it'll come straight up.
Sounds good. And if people want to get a hold of you, Melanie, and if they want to hear more about what you have to say, where can they find you?
Well, I have a podcast with Shannon Boucher. It's called the Weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report. We report on news and gender. Sometimes I like to do deep dives. I try to bring in some of the reading I do in queer papers in Canada as much as possible. So we do that. We release one every Sunday. So you're welcome to go and have a look at our YouTube channel. And I mostly, if I post, it's going to be on Twitter. So I am at FinkleDusty.
Right on. Well, to all the viewers and listeners, if you've made it this far, I just wanted to let you know that all the links are going to be in the description of this podcast, so you can check out Melanie and keep up with her and the podcast as well. Melanie, I just wanted to thank you once again for joining me and for going over these topics. I think this is pretty eye-opening, and I'm sure this information is going to help a lot of people. Until next time, I just want to thank everybody for listening, and take care and have a great week. Bye.
Cheers.